now resumed.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. There was a couple of housekeeping matters. You'll remember from yesterday I indicated that we would be marking the questions that were posed in writing to Carl English and the answers that were provided today, so I'll just take care of that quickly. First document is dated April 20, 2011. These are the questions posed by the area eagle netters and BC Fisheries Survival Coalition. Questions posed to Carl English, so we'd like that marked as the first exhibit, and just for the record, those questions were redacted as per the Commissioner's ruling. And then
That'll be marked as 1011.
Right, and then the next document would be the answers that were provided by Carl English. They still maintain the date of April 20, 2011, although they were provided on June 3rd. That would be an A, so...
Yes, that'll be marked as 1011A.
Thank you. And then the next set of questions and answers are re-examination questions directed to Carl English from Commission Council dated May 27, 2011, which would be the next exhibit.
1012.
And then the answers to those questions also dated on May 27, although provided on June 3rd, would be
1012A.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. To move back to the witnesses we have here today. Mr. Croy, I'd like to just talk to you about areas where RAR is not in effect. We've heard today that RAR is in effect in certain areas, since they're indicated in the regulation. In areas where RAR is not in effect, what is the role of Canada in assessing riparian area impacts?
Essentially, we perform our traditional role of reviewing development activities in riparian zones through the Fisheries Act lens, meaning we review a project to ensure compliance with the Fisheries Act and ensure that there is no net loss of habitat through project reviews.
And would the 1992 land development guidelines that we reviewed earlier apply?
Yes, that would be the foundational document. As we spoke yesterday, there's additional documents that have complemented it, but that is still foundational and still provides the primary guidance and direction with regards to what kind of standards we expect in terms of setbacks and activities in that riparian area, nearshore area.
Okay. And the streamlining processes that we talked about earlier today, those would also be in effect in the other areas of the province where RAR is not in effect?
That's correct.
Okay. And Mr. Salome, earlier in your testimony you referred to a number of municipalities where DFO was engaged in planning processes in your area. I understand that some of those municipalities had streamside protection bylaws or policies or guidelines prior to RAR coming in, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And what has happened in those municipalities since the introduction of RAR?
A large number of the municipalities recognize the benefits of the SPR and the additional protection they might provide to...
Sorry, just the SPR meaning what?
Sorry, between the use of the land development guidelines and implementation of the RAR, there was a short period where a streamside protection regulation was adopted by the provincial government. Some municipalities adopted that streamside protection regulation before it was replaced by the riparian areas regulation. It's more consistent with the simple assessment that is now in the riparian areas regulation. A fair number of municipalities in the Lower Mainland adopted or implemented that. They still maintain that type of approach. A few municipalities, notably, City of Coquitlam, went from a streamside protection regulation to the RAR, and largely applies detailed assessment, for example. In other municipalities, they're still applying the SPR type approach or a land development guideline approach, but it's a challenging situation for them because there's this detailed assessment out there that may offer a substantially smaller riparian width, and so they're having a challenge, and the department has a challenge rationalizing the wider riparian buffers that they would otherwise apply.
Okay. And we've been talking today and yesterday about physical intrusions into the riparian areas primarily. What about hydrological intrusions? Is that also a concern?
In urban areas, typical of the ones around the Lower Mainland where there's significant development, I would say that the two primary items that are activities that are causing decreases in watershed health and productivity are A, intrusions into the riparian zone, and B, changes in the hydrology. So when you cut down a significant portion of the forest in a watershed, that changes the rainfall interception and delivery of water to the ground and to the streams. When you replace soil and trees with rooftops or roadways, again, when that rain falls, instead of it being soaked into the treetops or the ground, it gets funneled quite rapidly to the stream. The volume of water that gets delivered increases, and this causes a massive erosion and destabilization of streams. Similarly, because that rainfall is being intercepted, there's often less groundwater recharge, so during summer periods, there's less base flow. So, we're talking about urban development here. It's important to keep in mind that both riparian integrity and the nature of the watershed and how stormwater is managed is very important.
Now, prior to the riparian areas regulation being brought in, was DFO working with Metro Vancouver on an integrated stormwater management plan?
Yes.
And how was that? What are the important features of that plan that we should be knowing about here today?
In recognition of the situation I just described, there was some effort to put together a way to describe watershed health in relation to riparian areas and hydrological changes. And the integrated stormwater management planning document, pages 2-3, has a chart that shows the relationship between riparian areas and hydrology. And it basically laid out a way that local governments could protect riparian zones and put in stormwater management features to maintain the watershed integrity. So it's based on one, measuring and planning for sustainable riparian buffers. It's a 30-meter buffer width. And implementing land use patterns that minimize hydrological changes in the watershed, minimize development footprint, and then incorporating things like rainwater infiltration features. So instead of the rainwater going down a catch basin and a pipe to the creek, it might first pass through a vegetated roadside swale, have the opportunity to have pollutants filtered out, have the opportunity to recharge the groundwater, and then if it must be released in a slow way that tries to mimic natural conditions. And so that was an approach that the Metro Vancouver GVRD municipalities worked on.
And just maybe to make the record complete, at tab 19 of Canada's documents is the Stormwater Source Control Design Guidelines 2005. Is that the document you're referring to?
That document describes some best management practices or rainwater infiltration features to help try and minimize the impacts of impervious surfaces in a watershed. And it complements the integrated stormwater planning document.
I'll have that marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 1013.
Thank you. And the planning that you were doing with, or that DFO was doing with Metro Vancouver with respect to stormwater impacts, has that been impacted at all by the introduction of the riparian areas regulation?
Well, as I mentioned, the watershed health tracking approach that Metro Vancouver was utilizing in that document had one of the axes based on riparian forest integrity, and the width that they utilized was a 30-meter buffer width. The challenge is that riparian areas regulation often specifies 10 to 15-meter setbacks for smaller streams, say 5 meters and less, which represents a large portion of stream length in many watersheds. So right off the bat, if one was to default to the detailed assessment approach, you might find yourself in a 50% riparian forest integrity situation. Then you take on top of that, road crossings, power line crossings, and other unavoidable intrusions. It puts riparian forest integrity into a challenging scenario. Fortunately, some of the local governments have realized their commitment to this integrated storm management planning approach and have maintained the larger buffer zones.
Under VAR, there is an exemption given to institutions. Can you explain how that works and whether it gives rise to any concerns? Well, first I'll ask Ms. Wilkerson, how does the institutional exemption work?
Well, there's not a specific exemption in RAR for institutions. It's just that it doesn't, institutions aren't caught in the description of development. So the RAR applies only to residential, commercial, and industrial development.
And does that give rise to any concerns from the provincial perspective?
Well, they would still be, they would still have to be compliant with the Fisheries Act.
Okay. And Mr. Solmy, do you have any concerns with well, I called it an exemption, but I guess it's not an express exemption. It's just it's not included in the works that are covered. Do you have any concern with the way institutions are treated under or not treated under the RAR?
It does give rise to some challenges. For example, the question is, well, then what standards should be used? Should we default to the land development guidelines that were in place prior to the streamside protection regulation? Should we apply the streamside protection regulation or detailed assessment approach that's in the RAR? What if the local government is not keen on supporting riparian protection? How do we encourage or require it? So it does cause some challenges.
Okay. And what about agricultural lands? Mrs. Wilkerson, are agricultural lands exempt under RAR?
Again, it's the activity that's caught under RAR, not the land. So on agricultural lands or in the ALR, a residential activity, for example, would be subject to the RAR, but any agricultural activities would not be subject to the RAR.
Okay. And does that cause any concerns for the province? Is there an intention to do anything about that?
There are standards being set at the Ministry of Environment with Ministry of Agriculture for farm building setbacks and similar agricultural development guidelines that are consistent with RAR. So that's in development right now.
Well, one of the challenges with agricultural land is much of it's already developed, and so it's not as if there's wide treed buffer zones or riparian areas on a lot of agricultural land, so we're often not involved. Local governments have limited roles on agricultural lands. The Right to Farm Act supersedes local government authority in a lot of cases, so we don't often get referrals for that kind of thing. Where there is trees, where it's clear there's fish habitat, we would apply appropriate standards such as land development guidelines or the riparian areas regulation. Where there isn't vegetation, there is this new guideline which Stacey has referred to. I believe it was finalized in February and it's starting to be rolled out now.
Can you use Section 35 of the Fisheries Act with respect to agricultural lands?
You can where there's riparian vegetation. It is a bit more challenging when farmers regularly plowing and cropping a field adjacent to a creek. The argument that there's a harmful alteration becomes a lot more difficult.
All right. Ms. Wilkerson, from your perspective, has RAR provided any benefits to salmon habitat protection over previous legislation and regulation?
Well, I guess the main benefit would be that it's a requirement for local governments now in the areas where RAR applies to have riparian protection within their bylaws, where before it wasn't a requirement. And from a practical perspective, I think, in respect to the lakeshore development that we've seen over the past few years, there are a lot more developments, I think, that would have been in much closer proximity to the lake if something like RAR had not been implemented.
What about deficiencies with RAR? Where would you like to see improvements made in that regulation?
Well, I think from a practical perspective, we've been challenged mostly with enforcing infractions. RAR itself isn't enforceable. It was not designed to be. It was designed to be. So if somebody is in violation of the RAR, they're either going to be in violation of a local government bylaw, the Fisheries Act, or the Water Act. But as it's been discussed earlier, Fisheries Act, becomes difficult. It becomes prosecution with the local government bylaw. It has been effective in some cases. Some local governments have been quite good about enforcing their bylaws, but if they won't, then that becomes a challenge.
Mr. Crow, what is your view of this regulation? Has it been a benefit to protecting riparian area habitats in BC, or in BCI where you work?
Yeah, I have two opinions of the riparian areas regulation. One is that it has definitely provided some benefits. I like that riparian setbacks are now under regulation to complement the Fisheries Act. I think that has been a substantial improvement. Before we went from a guideline, land development guidelines were just that, guidelines. Now there's actually a regulation for standards. And the other piece actually is very important, as the riparian areas regulation actually also applies to brownfield sites. A brownfield site is a previously disturbed area, and where there's previously a historical high degree of development, and essentially the habitat features and functions have been eliminated because of historic practices. The Fisheries Act is essentially not easily applied to new development because we're not protecting habitat. It's already missing. The riparian areas regulation's strength is that it identifies stream site protection and enhancement areas, and the enhancement is the key piece here, in that it does not necessarily recognize just habitat features, but also potential for habitat. So it protects an area for the purposes of trying to promote the restoration or recovery of that area. So in terms of the primary objective of the habitat policy, which is for the net gain of the National Policy for Habitat Management, which is the net gain of habitat, this enhancement component to the RAR is definitely complementary and something I strongly support and endorse as an improvement in our ability to regulate foreshore areas.
Right. And do you have similar concerns that Ms. Wilkerson identified with respect to enforceability?
Yes, I share her concerns. I think that the delivery through local governments creates a very complicated environment for senior governments, the province and DFO to try to deliver a standard and level playing field, essentially being the regulation subjected to the variances between local governments actually results in somewhat very disjointed, and I'd describe sort of balkanized regulatory environment for us to work within. I will use an example like the Columbia-Shuswap Regional District, where the setback standards actually vary between electoral districts within one regional district. The reliance essentially on local governments to deliver administrative penalties, I think, is a shortcoming and does not give the Department of Fisheries and Oceans or the Ministry of Environment a lot of the compelling tools to get a higher degree of compliance by local governments, proponents, and QEPs. I think the professional reliance model has its place. I'm not sure it's necessarily most appropriately delivered in this situation. So essentially I share excuse me. I share many of the same concerns as Ms. Wilkerson. I think that it has some great strengths, but there's clearly areas where this regulation could be far more effective in meeting our mutual objectives.
That you would like to see to the regulation other than what you've touched on just now?
I think a more standardized approach, a more compelling system of to ensure compliance, and yeah, I think those are my two primary concerns.
Right, and DFO's role under VAR is, in terms of operational involvement, is limited to the issuance of variances. Do you understand that to be consistent with DFO's Section 35 responsibilities?
This actually is a very interesting point. It's actually in front of the BC Court of Appeal right now, which is that Department of Fisheries and Oceans habitat management staff, we get our authority through the habitat provisions of the Fisheries Act, and that is essentially to protect habitat. Now, under the riparian areas regulation, we are responsible for the adjudication of all variances, regardless of whether or not it's a greenfield site where any variance will likely result in a HAD, or a brownfield, which is a previously disturbed site where the habitat values may be highly degraded. And therefore, we're asked to adjudicate development plans that don't necessarily have a HAD. And right now, in front of the BC Court of Appeal, the regulation is being challenged as that the opinion is that DFO does not actually have the authority to adjudicate those variances where there's not going to be a HAD. So I think it's important to get that legal issue resolved to confirm whether and how variances are to be managed, particularly in brownfield circumstances.
Mr. Salome, would you like to address anything on these two issues?
I'd like to support what Michael and Stacey have said about some of the positives of the riparian area regulation. For example, it requires local government through regulation to address riparian areas. And that's good for local governments that weren't doing that. Some of the other shortcomings I feel with the RER are, first of all, it's a fairly complicated process. The whole QEP assessment is, in my mind, overly complicated. There's a lot of work to come up with either a 10-meter or a 15-meter setback, and I'm not sure that the parsing out of 10, 10.5, 11, 12, 13, whatever meter setbacks is really that relevant. At the end of the day, what we want is a functional riparian zone that is going to be sustained in an urban environment. And to do that, I think it's more important to focus on what is a sustainable width and what are the measures that will sustain it. And that part of the regulation or the assessment methodology is weak. The other thing is I think it's a poor planning tool. And it makes it difficult for local governments to plan in a sustainable way. What's nice is if a local government says, here's the vision we have for this watershed, here's what we'd like to see in terms of sustaining fish habitat into the future. What do we need to do to make that happen? And I think the riparian area regulation takes that away to some extent, because it simply says on a site-by-site basis you can do a detailed assessment and come up with a riparian zone width. You could apply the riparian areas regulation at a subdivision phase or land planning phase when you don't really know what the adjacent development is going to be, and so you can't prescribe the measures. You might then come up with a minimum width that would not be adequate in the future plan. So I think it's not an ideal planning tool.
Can I just offer one more?
Yep.
I'll keep it very short, but in any process where we're trying to coordinate and cooperate with the other bodies, it's important that everyone centrally is in agreement with the overall objective. And where a local government is in agreement with the objectives of RAR and is essentially a willing partner to deliver a mutually agreed upon objective, I think RAR can be very effective. The challenge is that, and I come back to the statement of balkanization, I will speak to my area, there's still many local governments who don't actually necessarily feel it's their responsibility and obligation to deliver RAR, that's the responsibility of the province and DFO, and essentially resent and disagree with their responsibilities and work I would say, against the objectives of RAR. So it has to do with ensuring that you're working with partners. You cannot compel a partner to work with you cooperatively. I think partnerships have to be done, and when people come to you willingly.
And on that note, I'd like to move to the last two issues I wanted to cover today. One is the the Shuswap Lake Integrated Planning Process, which has been called SLIP. And then I wanted to talk to Ms. Wilkerson about a project that she's worked on as well, which is the Lakeshore Development Compliance Project. So I'll start with SLIP, and most of these questions are directed to you, Mr. Crow. I'll first start by calling up document tab 17, which is the SLIP strategic plan.
Yes, I am.
All right, well, I'll get that marked, please, right off the bat.
Exhibit 1014.
That's okay.
Okay, and can you tell us what SLIP is and why it was created?
I'll try to keep this short, but to explain SLIP, you have to understand the development context of Shuswap Lake. Essentially, for the longest time, Shuswap Lake was which is in the southern BC interior, a fairly slow-growing, quiet lake, some recreational development, but a lot of people had chosen to live around this lake for lifestyles, and they liked how quiet it was. And actually there was an active desire by the constituents not to have much in the way of local government control and authority. So therefore, for much of this lake system, it does have some communities like Sicamous and Salmon Arm on it, but much of it does not have standard local government controls, such as official community plans, bylaws, building inspection, and so on. And essentially the community liked it that way. About 10 years ago, a council chose to vote in some increased governance, and they were actually voted out at the next local government elections, and all those systems they were put in place were rescinded. Approximately 10 to 15 years ago, as I spoke of earlier, the rate of development, particularly of an intensive recreational character, expanded substantially, and essentially the community and the lake was changing. There was a great number of very large resort developments, very large marinas, more houseboats, larger homes, bigger boats, and in actual fact, the people of the lake did not feel that the values that they had drawn them to the lake and kept them there were being maintained. And there was actually, starting in the mid 2000s, actually a desire to have more government control activities in Shuswap Lake system. The problem was that, as I explained, there was no local government controls that are normally standard for determining where development occurred, the character and nature of development. There was no zoning and bylaws, building inspection, and so on. So it was and therefore resorts were popping up all over the place. And in the absence of local government controls, plus at a time when the provincial and federal governments were downsizing and redirecting their priorities, there was really no overall governance or management of Shuswap Lake in a fairly effective or coherent manner. And in this sort of atmosphere of, I'd say, it was a bit chaotic, the provincial colleague felt that it was time to actually implement, in the absence of strong local or provincial and federal engagement and control, that we really needed to look at a new way of governing Shuswap Lake. Therefore, he coordinated with representatives of the three levels of government, the Fraser Basin Council, approaches to First Nations, and tried to basically create an integrated management planning process that would step in and fill the vacuum created by the absence of good governance. So that essentially was a background to the Shuswap Lake Integrated Planning process. It was essentially an attempt at the local level to try to get those agencies that had some effect or authority to coordinate and be more effective in how they did their business, to try to stem the rate and location and character of much of the development of Shuswap Lake and try to, fill basically a governance or a regulatory gap.
And what was the Department of Fisheries and Oceans' role in this project?
Well, the SLIP process had a number of key objectives. There was an attempt to manage for water quality, an attempt to direct and manage recreation, and an attempt to manage foreshore development, with some overarching strategies or objectives with regards to improved education, better enforcement, coordinated enforcement on the lake, and a few other strategies. I can't quite remember them, though they are in the document. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans joined the steering committee, became a member of the Foreshore Development Technical Review Committee, became a member of the Compliance and Enforcement Coordinated Compliance and Enforcement Group, and took a role with regards to helping basically hold a number of public meetings and so on to try to determine if there was public interest and if we could garner and support for this type of initiative. Another piece that was quite important for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans was developing a foreshore mapping tool because we understood that to manage this lake system we had to have a good inventory of all the development initiatives on the lake, and that actually then has led to a foreshore mapping product, which then led into a habitat index analysis, and that has led now to guidance tools to try to give more specific direction to how development activity should occur on the lake.
And Shuswap Lake obviously is an important lake for Fraser River sockeye.
Yes. Shuswap Lake is essentially the rearing lake for the Adams River run. If actually in this picture here you can see the Adams River in the bottom right hand corner running into Shuswap Lake at the western end of the lake.
And this lake system was one of the lake systems where there was incomplete coverage once VAR was brought in, right? It had some areas were not covered by VAR, some were covered by VAR but wasn't properly implemented initially, and so there was a mixed riparian protection regime for this lake system. Is that fair?
Yes. In 2007 there was virtually no official community plans, which are foundational to developing zoning and bylaws. We now have a OCP for the North Shore, but large other portions of the lake don't even have OCPs yet.
Right. Do you think that the SLIP project is a good project? Has it been successful in bringing some planning coherence to this lake and protecting riparian areas in the lake?
I think it's been a very good process. I think it has refocused agencies on the importance of the management of Shuswap Lake. I think it has done a good job of bringing agencies with possibly divergent interests to the table to figure out ways to coordinate and cooperate and reach mutual objectives. And I think it has brought a degree of understanding amongst all sectors, including the development sector, to how development should occur on Shuswap Lake. And I think it has been a motivation to the Columbia-Shuswap Regional District to continue moving forward with the development of bylaws and other local governance tools to control Shuswap Lake into the future. I think the provincial staff deserve full credit for coming up with this idea and having driven it from its inception.
And is there funding provided by the federal government or the province to the SLIP process?
Yes, but nothing secure. We apply to our own funding sources to contribute to specific projects with regards to SLIP. The province, my understanding, does essentially the same, but there's no secure body of funding for Shuswap Lake the integrated planning process. Right now, actually, the steering committee, which has evolved and is now delivered primarily through local government representatives, is actually trying to come up with a taxation system to provide secure long-term funding for SLIP.
I just want to identify a document that was marked Monday or Tuesday this week, which is Exhibit 983. And I just want to ask you to identify whether this document reflects the water quality monitoring plan that has been brought in through this, or for that lake system, which has been brought in through the SLIP process.
That's right. That was one water quality monitoring plan project that was conceived of and implemented for the purposes of supporting particularly the water quality management objective of SLIP.
Okay, thank you. And now the last questions relate to the Lakeshore Development Compliance Project. These questions are from Ms. Wilkerson. Tab 14 of our materials has a document which is the Lakeshore Development Compliance Project document, Phase 1, defining the issues across BC. What is this project, and is it related at all to RAR?
Well, this project came about, the Compliance Division of the Ministry of Environment said to the Ecosystems Branch, we will fund a compliance project for you. So what is your biggest compliance concern provincially? And almost every region came back and said that lakeshore development was one of the biggest issues that we had, or that we thought we had with compliance in the province. So we started this project to really look at the scope of the problem to see whether this really was a problem. We suspected it was. And so we chose 32 lakes across the province where we did a baseline inventory and compliance assessments. So baseline inventory, we essentially videotaped the shoreline and to give us a benchmark of where the state of development was right now. Sometimes prosecutions can be difficult because we don't have sort of a historical look at what the lakeshore might have looked like the year before. And so when development occurs that's not compliant, then we felt like this would give us a tool to show sort of a before and after picture, essentially. It also gave us a state of the foreshore. We looked at, we measured the amount of riparian vegetation, foreshore modifications, just things that would give us a picture of where we were at. And then we did a compliance assessment on selected areas of the lakes to see what compliance levels were. We originally thought we would look at all sorts of different statutes. We thought, and this was a multi-agency project, we brought members in from stewardship groups, from other ministries within the provincial government, and we had a DFO rep on the project as well. So we thought we'd look at Fisheries Act compliance, Water Act compliance, RAR, and then we realized what a huge project that was, and that just looking at Water Act alone would be very informative. So we kept it to the Water Act.
And how do you anticipate this information will be used by the province now?
Well, it's been used in different regions, and I mean the headquarters-driven part of the project is completed now. But regionally, it's been used to start collaborative planning processes between the different levels of government and stewardship groups. Several regions have used it to develop shoreline management guidelines, and some regions have told me that they're starting to use it now to look at compliance, taking compliance actions.
Do you expect that this work will be continued into the future?
Like I said, it will be continued regionally. We now have, with this project, we developed a pretty extensive methodology, and so that methodology is now available, and we have the equipment. It's just a lot of equipment involved with this, so we have that available for regions. We also have shared this with other groups that want to do similar work.
And is this related to the SLIP work we just heard about through Mr. Crow?
Well, it's similar in that the issue is very similar, but we specifically didn't look at Shuswap Lake because SLIP was going on at the same time. We had a member on our project from DFO that was also, I believe, involved with the SLIP process at the time. So there were some similarities, but they were sort of being developed at the same time.
And I should have this marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 1015.
Thank you. Those are the questions. Thank you very much. I know it was a long day with me, but thank you very much. Our next person to ask you questions will be Mr. Fougere from Canada.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. My name is Charles Fougere, F-U-G-E-R-E, Counsel for the Government of Canada. I'm here with my colleague, Mr. Hugh McCauley. I was initially allocated 30 minutes and then told to try to keep it as short as possible, so I'll do my very best to be done in less than 30 minutes. Basically, Ms. Baker has covered very thoroughly the details of this topic, and my questions will try to focus on the bigger picture. Before I begin, however, I wonder if we could have document 17 on Canada's list of documents brought up. Could we go to the next page, please? Third page. Okay, so Mr. Salome, is this the integrated stormwater management planning that you were discussing with Ms. Baker earlier today?
Yes, I was referring to diagrams on page 2.3 and 2.4 of this document.
Could we have this marked as an exhibit, please?
2016.
And can we go to page 2.3 and 2.4? I know it's a weird numbering system.
I'll suggest 2.4
2.4.
if we have limited time.
This is the graph that you had in mind?
Yes.
Do you comment? Can you please comment on how you interpret this graph?
Well, I believe there was some discussion of the cabin process earlier. This health tracking process is based on a similar concept. That is, you can look at the diversity and numbers of benthic organisms, or organisms which are growing in the stream, the bugs of the stream. And if you go to a stream and you sample a number of the bugs and you lay out the different numbers and types, you can get an idea of the health of that stream. If there's pollution, you have one type of worm that's abundant, for example. If it's unpolluted, you have a good diversity of bugs. So using that as a basis, Metro Vancouver correlated bug scores or stream health with riparian forest integrity and total impervious area. And you know, with all things in science, the exact correlation is sometimes, you know, hard to pin down. But looking at a significant number of streams in the Lower Mainland and the Pacific Northwest, this graph makes a lot of sense. And it basically says the better the forest integrity and the lower the impervious or effective impervious area in the watershed, the healthier a stream is going to be.
Thank you. So I'll be moving on to my bigger picture theme, and I'll start with a question which is following up on a question raised by Mr. Commissioner yesterday. So I will be addressing that question to you, Mr. Crow, since you answered yesterday's question. And it has to do with the importance and the situation of riparian habitat within the bigger concept of fish habitat. Is it your understanding that the definition of fish habitat under the Fisheries Act in the fish habitat protection provisions includes and covers riparian habitat?
Yes, it does. The definition of fish habitat in the Fisheries Act includes those elements that affect fish directly and indirectly. So you have things that are quite clear, like spawning substrate, that clearly affect fish, but it also does include and encompass things like trees, because of everything they do to control the conditions within the stream. And as an example, bugs are also fish habitat because of the fish's dependence on them, and those processes that support the bugs, essentially it would be an indirect form of fish habitat.
Thank you. And if we take any given stream or lake that is considered sockeye habitat, and we completely destroy the natural riparian habitat by developing without compensation projects, how is this likely to affect sockeye survival and productivity in that stream or lake? In other words, is the water portion of the habitat sufficient if we lose the riparian portion of the habitat?
It is not possible to maintain a healthy stream without a healthy riparian zone. There's just too many components of a stream that are directly dependent on the health of the riparian area. I can provide you with quite a number of examples where historical development activities have degraded entirely the riparian area, and effectively the stream has lost all of its capacity to support fish. The channels change shape. They become wider and shallower. The substrates fill in with sediment that washes out of the banks. They become highly mobile, shifting back and forth. All the cover features that the juvenile fish are absolutely dependent upon to survive disappear. There is no way to have a healthy stream without healthy riparian areas. And there's a very quick collapse in fish utilization of streams once the riparian areas disappear. We have seen that very frequently in situations where you have a healthy riparian zone. You have good functioning stream systems in terms of how they're supposed to behave hydraulically and physically, and they have good fish populations. Where that habitat basically is lost, fish do not, the salmon and trout species cannot survive in those areas. Unlike, some species such as perch and bass, which are not particularly dependent on riparian areas, and they can essentially be quite successful in very poor habitat conditions. Sockeye, other salmon, and trout are very dependent on healthy aquatic ecosystems. You cannot have healthy fish populations without healthy streams, and that's completely dependent on healthy riparian areas.
And you referred to there being several examples of a situation where the fish population suffered. Can you give us one quick example?
Well, I would. The one that would come to mind immediately would be the Salmon River near Salmon Arm, where after decades of agricultural development, transportation corridors, transmission lines, rural and development, the stream became exceeding unhealthy. It once had a sockeye population of 500,000, and there's just a remnant number of a few dozen to 100 on the dominant Adams years. Most years there's no sockeye in that stream. Chinook and coho populations have also collapsed and are only surviving due to our intensive hatchery production support programs.
Is the concept of cumulative impacts something that is relevant in evaluating the risk posed by urbanization and development on sockeye salmon?
It's one of the key items that impact fish habitat. It's no one thing in most cases that can be pointed to as causing declines of fish or impacts to fish. It's often the cumulative impacts. It's not just having no riparian standard, it's the road crossings that eliminate the riparian areas. It's the residential properties where individuals have removed some of the trees and the temperature of the stream has increased because of that. It's pollution that comes from runoff, or sediment that comes from runoff that enters the stream. It's intrusions into the riparian zone by various activities that might occur in an urban area. It's the often constant pressure that fish habitat and riparian zones receive from recreational activity, from development, from maintenance activities for things like flooding. It's all these things that together begin to degrade the overall health and then the quality of a stream and fish habitat.
Thank you. Now back to Mr. Crow. I take it that you're generally familiar with DFO's wild salmon policy?
Yes, I am.
So I don't need to go to the document in the interest of time, but could you tell me, Is the protection of healthy riparian habitat a necessary condition to the success of the wild salmon policy in sustaining Fraser River sockeye?
It's an essential part. It's under Strategy 2, which is sort of essentially the inventory and understanding of our watershed health, ecosystem health. We need, you cannot have, as I said, healthy systems without healthy riparian zones. Therefore, to be able to deliver on the wild salmon policy to protect wild stocks, conservation units, it's essential that you have healthy riparian areas.
And thank you. Continuing with you, Mr. Crow, the Commissioner has heard during this commission that urbanization and development booms in the past have had very negative impacts on sockeye habitat. And yesterday, I think you gave evidence that in your area in the last 10 years, there was a marked increase in waterfront development. And you also indicated, I think today, that your area was likely to undergo a population growth. Same thing for the Lower Fraser area. And in that context, my question to you is, do we have any knowledge now that we did not have before to allow us to manage development in a sockeye-friendly way, or is development directly incompatible with protecting fish habitat?
When you look at salmon populations in North America, where have they collapsed? They've collapsed on the East Coast and to the south of us through the western states. And we can point to factors such as fishing as a component of those collapses, but clearly it is development impacting habitat that has resulted in large part to those populations, conservation units being essentially eliminated. And now the United States is spending a substantial amount of money trying to restore salmon populations, viable populations in many of the western states. And there's quite a number that are listed under the Endangered Species Act, and it's an next to impossible task to recover those types of populations once the habitat has been destroyed. We have a situation now where we can reflect on what has happened before. I know that science papers 3 and 12 for this commission were not able to make any correlation between population effects and any type of the indicators that were chosen for those studies. I'm not necessarily in agreement with the methods within those studies, and I feel that there was actually some mistakes made. So I don't agree with the findings. I think habitat clearly has an effect on the health of salmon populations. You look particularly at species like Chinook and Coho and how they have preceded sockeye in terms of population level effect changes, in large part to freshwater changes. You can only predict that unless we change our management of habitat, that sockeye will continue down to will have continuing problems. I suggest that the habitat management program of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is here to try to protect what remains, to prevent another Cultus Lake circumstance, which is, of course, devastating for that CU, but also it has such substantial effects to fishing communities and fishermen and the economy. So my answer is yes, we understand how development can proceed in such a way to protect and conserve fish populations and stocks, but I do believe that means collectively we have to figure out better ways to manage the habitat that remains and restore some that's lost. But it really is about managing the cumulative incremental harms that occur over time, the thousands of little cuts that appear not to be a big deal, but effectively over time do have a substantial effect.
This question for Mr. Salome. One of the things that we've heard from this panel today is the importance of partnerships and that DFO and the province can't do it alone. Could you please tell us who are the key partners that you need around the table to get the fish protection, habitat protection work done? Could you list the partners and explain what you would ideally want from them?
Well, I guess in short, the easy answer is us and everyone else. It starts with individuals in the community that raise the importance of salmon with their elected officials and encourage the steps required to protect salmon habitat. I think one of the key players in key partners is the local land use authority, be it the regional district, be it the local First Nation, be it the local municipality or the Port Authority. The land use authority that dictates the future plans and the OCP and how we develop are really the ones that are going to be dictating the nature of the cumulative impacts. I showed you the graph with impervious area in a watershed and how that affects hydrology and stream health. DFO has, or the province has, limited ability to push a local government to design a development so that the houses are more compact and there's less impervious area. We have limited ability to go to a local government and tell them to implement green infrastructure or those infiltration features everywhere. That's the kind of thing that the local government has to plan for and implement themselves. But for local government to do that, they need elected officials that have the support from their community to do that. So we need community groups and citizens to ensure that they speak their voice about what they see as important in their community. We need user groups like First Nations and fishermen to make sure they speak or represent their values for salmon and ensure that they say, look, we recognize the importance of habitat and good planning if we want to have salmon into the future. So I think it's everyone, but ultimately I think vision and leadership from provincial, federal, and local land use authorities is key.
Thank you. I will direct my next question to Ms. Wilkerson. We've heard about the issue of compliance with RAR at the local government level, and this was covered by Ms. Baker. I was wondering if you could tell us, as someone who has very good knowledge and familiarity with the RAR regime, what should be the next step in terms of next changes or next steps in terms of improving local government compliance with RAR? Is it a matter of integrating harsh enforcement provisions in RAR? Is it a matter of educating local governments on the importance of riparian habitat? What input would you offer?
Well, as far as improving local government compliance, that's something that we're at the point now. We've been sort of reluctant, I guess, to our role has been to support them, encourage them to comply, and we're seeing improvements in compliance with local governments that we didn't think we'd ever get. So we are feeling positive about that. However, we're probably getting to the point soon where if local governments refuse to comply, then we have to look at what we can do under the regulation to either to do some sort of regulatory change that would allow us to have more to include enforcement provisions for local governments, or to actually look at I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And in terms of the relationship between DFO and BC on the implementation of RAR and the collaboration between the province and Canada, what do you think could be improved? How could DFO and BC work better together at implementing RAR?
Well, I think my experience has been a fairly positive one. Since I started on the RAR, we have a coordination committee that meets monthly, and it's DFO, the province, and a representative from the Union of British Columbia Municipalities. And I always find that we have really open and frank discussions about where we're at and what we need to move forward with. I think having consistent contacts for us, I think the biggest challenge for me is that people's roles within DFO change fairly regularly, as do in the province, and to always keep somebody as a contact either in regional headquarters to communicate with me, so somebody in my equivalent position would be very helpful.
Perhaps I'll finish by inviting Mr. Salome and Mr. Crow to comment if you have anything to add to this answer, improving BC and DFO work on RAR.
I would agree with Ms. Wilkerson that yes, DFO's struggles to maintain a somewhat consistent representation has been problematic. I would say that in light of many pressures on the program from different sources, it has been hard to keep senior management's focused on this issue and some of the challenges that have to be resolved between the two senior between the governments at a more senior level. So I would concur with her comment. The other piece is yeah, I'm sorry. I think that I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Mr. Salome?
I've reinforced the comments from my colleagues here as well. I think something that would help is some effort around efficacy. Some of the challenges that we face is, questions about the efficacy of RAR from not only colleagues but users, and it's been in place for some time now. It would be nice to do some efficacy assessment to see if there are areas for adjustment or improvement. Some true science that could help support the application and therefore promote the application of the regulation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Proust for the province would be next, and he says he's got less than 5 minutes. If we could do that, maybe then we can split the afternoon between the other two groups.
Yes, thank you. Ms. Wilkerson, I just wanted to ask if you had anything that you wanted to add to anything that you've had to say today, or?
Not at the moment.
That'll make Ms. Baker very happy. And my second question, and maybe a bit of a commentary, is to Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow, first of all, thank you very much for your compliments to the province on the SLIP process, which I think will be much appreciated. By the same token, the role of DFO that you explained in that process obviously was very critical to the process. Would you not agree?
I would agree.
And likewise, one of the good parts of what I think is a very good news story is that the CSRD over the years has had a somewhat miraculous transformation as well, has become quite vigilant on these issues. Is that not correct? That's something you've observed over the last few years, particularly with respect to the SLIP process. They've firmly endorsed it.
Yes, as I said, I think that the SLIP process has helped motivate the Columbia Shuswap regional directors to become far more supportive and engaged in moving towards coordinating and cooperating with SLIP, as well as starting to make the changes within CSRD with regards to their authorities to, I think, set the Columbia Shuswap Regional District up for a more sustainable future in terms of conservation protection of foreshore values, habitat, and meeting water quality and other recreational and societal objectives.
Mr. Crow, your colleague referred to work in this the riparian area being everybody's job, and my understanding, and I may be wrong, is that that's reflected, that the process document itself, Exhibit 1014, is a document that doesn't have an author simply because it was the document that was the result of work by everybody who was involved in that process, which I think is a model for collaboration. Would you not agree?
I would, yes.
Thank you.
Then we have two questioners left, so if we were to take a break, this would be the time to do it, I think.
Here we go, recess for 10 minutes.